The glass crunching under the heavy tactical boots in St. Jude's intensive care unit didn't sound like a hospital, it sounded like a war zone. But the woman pressed against the cold marble wall, her light blue scrubs stained with a spray of crimson that didn't belong to a patient, wasn't begging for her life. And the wide, glossy eyes staring at the lead assassin weren't filled with the fear of a victim, but the cold, calculating focus of a catalyst. For 4 years, the high-ranking surgeons at St. Jude's thought Maria Baker was just the NPC of the graveyard shift, the quiet, mahogany-skinned nurse who moved with a soft shuffle and apologized for occupying space. They saw a woman who was fragile. They saw a woman who was invisible. They were wrong. When the professional cleaners locked down the wing, they thought they were the apex predators entering a defenseless cage. They didn't know they had just barricaded themselves in a high-tech tomb with the only person the sovereign of Soul's underworld would burn the world to protect. This is the story of the night a team of elite killers realized that the most dangerous place in orbit isn't a dark alley in the slums. It's the hospital ward of a woman who carries the mark of the dragon. It was 3:12 a.m. on a sweltering Tuesday when the humid city air finally shattered into a violent downpour, drumming against the reinforced glass of St. Jude's. On the private surgical floor, the air was a heavy cocktail of industrial antiseptic, ozone, and the rhythmic, robotic wheeze of life support. These were the ghost hours, where the line between reality and nightmare thins to a thread. Maria Baker sat at the nurse's station, the flickering blue light of a heart rate monitor reflecting in eyes that held lightning. To any casual observer, Maria was a non-entity. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, practical knot. Her shoulders were habitually rounded as if she were trying to melt into the whitewashed walls. She never raised her voice. She never sought the spotlight. She was the perfect shadow, right up until the moment the first bullet hit the glass, and the wife of Uday Kwan decided it was time to stop pretending. The fluorescent hum of St. Jude's at 4 a.m. was the only sound in the sterile expanse of the West Wing, a sound Maria Baker had come to find comforting. It was a frequency that matched her own existence, constant, necessary, and entirely ignored. She moved down the corridor with a soft, practiced gait, her light blue scrubs whispering against the linoleum. Her shoulders were perpetually rounded, a physical manifestation of her desire to be a ghost in a world of giants. At the central hub, Dr. Phil, a man whose ego was as sharp as his tailored white coat, didn't even look up as Maria placed a stack of updated charts on the desk. He was laughing at a video on his phone, leaning back with an air of untouchable authority. "Hey, NPC," Phil called out, not bothering to use her name. "Room 402 needs a fresh bag. And try not to fumble the line this time. Some of us actually have a schedule to keep." Maria paused, her fingers grazing the platinum band hidden beneath her latex glove. She didn't flinch at the nickname, non-player character. To Phil and the other elite residents, she was merely part of the furniture, a background asset required to keep the lights on while they performed the real miracles. "Of course, Doctor," she murmured, her voice a low, melodic tremor that betrayed nothing of the storm brewing behind her ribs. "I don't know how you do it, Maria," whispered Rebecca, a younger intern who hadn't yet lost her humanity. "He treats you like you're invisible." "Being invisible has its advantages, Rebecca," Maria replied, her eyes tracking a shadowy figure moving near the service elevator on the security monitor. Her gaze remained fixed for a second too long, not with the confusion of a nurse, but with the tactical assessment of a sentry. "You see the things people think no one is watching." She turned away, heading toward the supply closet. As she walked, she adjusted the fit of her scrubs, her posture momentarily straightening before she caught herself and slumped back into her disguise. She knew the hierarchy of St. Jude's better than anyone. She knew who held the power and who merely wore it like a costume. Dr. Phil thought he was the apex of this ecosystem because he held a scalpel. He didn't realize that the woman he just insulted was the only reason the most dangerous man in Seoul hadn't leveled this hospital to find a single leak. Maria stepped into the shadows of the supply hall, the cool blue light of the exit sign reflecting in eyes that were no longer wide with apology, but sharp with a lethal, dormant precision. The graveyard shift had only just begun, and the elites were about to learn that the background characters are the ones who decide how the story ends. The transition from life to death began not with a scream, but with a rhythmic, mechanical failure. One moment, the West Wing was a fortress of high-tech humming and sterile order. The next, a heavy metallic thud vibrated through the floor, the sound of the main breakers being purged. The world went black. It was a thick, unnatural darkness that seemed to swallow the very oxygen in the rooms. Then, the emergency circuits kicked in, but they didn't bring back the soothing white light. Instead, the corridors were bathed in the rhythmic, pulsing crimson of the emergency beacons. The red light lockdown had begun. Maria stood perfectly still in the center of the darkened supply hall. Around her, the hospital descended into a panicked cacophony. The robotic wheeze of the ventilators stopped, replaced by the desperate, high-pitched chirping of battery backup alarms. From the nurse's station, she heard Dr. Phil's voice, stripped of its arrogance, cracking into a jagged edge of fear. "What is this? Maintenance. Why aren't the generators kicking over?" Maria didn't answer. She knew the generators weren't coming on because they had been bypassed with professional precision. She felt the shift in the air pressure before she heard the footsteps, the heavy, synchronized tread of boots that didn't belong to any orderly. These were the movements of men who moved in the stacks, clearing corners with suppressed muzzles and thermal optics. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs, her fingers closing around her burner phone. The screen remained dark, but she knew the signal had already been sent. In the red pulse of the emergency lights, Maria's slumped shoulders finally squared. The timid nurse was gone. In her place stood a woman who had spent years memorizing the structural weaknesses of every exit, every vent, and every shadowed corner of St. Jude's. "Stay down, Phil," she whispered into the darkness, her voice no longer a melodic tremor, but a cold, flat command. A heavy magnetic lock clicked shut at the end of the hall, the sound of a cage door closing. The hospital was no longer a place of healing, it was a kill box. But as the first shadow of a gunman lengthened against the red-streaked floor, Maria didn't retreat. She reached for a tray of stainless steel instruments, her eyes reflecting the crimson pulse with a terrifying, dormant hunger. The assassins thought they had cut the power to trap their prey. They didn't realize they had just given the ghost of Soul's wife the darkness she needed to begin her work. The heavy magnetic locks engaged with a final, echoing clack, sealing the West Wing into a pressurized tomb. Within the rhythmic pulse of the crimson emergency lights, the supply closet became a sanctuary of shadows. Maria didn't panic. She moved with the fluid, automated grace of someone who had practiced for a war she hoped would never come. The heavy door at the end of the hall groaned as a crowbar forced the seal. 3 men slipped through, their movements synchronized and professional. They wore charcoal tactical gear, their faces obscured by ballistic masks, carrying suppressed submachine guns that looked like toys in the deceptive red light. They moved with the confidence of men who expected to find sheep huddled in a corner. "Check the station," the leader hissed, his voice distorted by his mask. "Find the girl. The boss wants her alive, but he didn't say she had to be intact." Maria watched them through the narrow gap in the closet door. Her breathing was shallow, controlled. She reached for a gallon jug of medical-grade lubricant and a roll of heavy-duty surgical tape. She wasn't looking for a weapon, she was looking for an advantage. As the first assassin approached the closet, his boots clicking on the linoleum, Maria didn't wait for him to open the door. She kicked it outward with a sudden, violent force, the heavy metal edge catching the man squarely in the face. As he stumbled back, clutching his shattered mask, she stepped into the hallway. She wasn't the NPC anymore. Her posture was straight, her eyes reflecting the red strobe like a predator's. Before the second gunman could level his weapon, Maria threw the open jug of lubricant across the floor. He slipped, his feet sliding out from under him in a graceless sprawl. In the heartbeat of his confusion, Maria was on him. She didn't use a fist, she used a heavy, stainless steel kidney basin, swinging it with a precision that targeted the temple. The third man, the leader, swung his muzzle toward her, but Maria had already vanished back into the shadows of a patient room. "You're dead, bitch," he roared, firing a burst into the drywall. The suppressed shots were nothing more than soft coughs in the dark. Maria pressed her back against the wall, listening to the frantic, heavy breathing of the man she had just humiliated. She looked at the small cut on her cheek, the blood warm and sticky. She thought of Daquan. She thought of the promise he had made her when they wed. "I am the sword, Maria, but you are the hand that guides it." For the first time in 4 years, the hand was tired of guiding. It wanted to strike. She gripped a long, serrated orthopedic saw from a nearby tray, her expression settling into a mask of cold, regal fury. The assassins thought they were here to kidnap a nurse. They were about to find out that Maria Baker didn't need a husband to be the most dangerous person in the room. Maria retreated into the darkened break room, the serrated saw gripped in one hand while her left fumbled for the burner phone hidden in the waistband of her scrubs. The red pulse of the emergency lights painted her mahogany skin in shades of rust and shadow. She didn't call the police. She didn't call the front desk. Instead, she entered a single character into the keypad, a simple period, and hit send. That one was the dead man's switch for a life she had tried to bury. 10 miles away, in a glass-walled sanctuary overlooking the rain-lashed Han River, the air was still and smelled of expensive sandalwood and cold steel. Yu Daquan sat behind a desk of carved obsidian, his eyes fixed on a digital map of his empire's shipping lanes. He was a man of absolute stillness, a predator who ruled not by noise, but by gravity. A soft, melodic chime broke the silence. It was a sound reserved for only one device, a phone kept in a lined drawer that had not rung in 4 years. Daquan didn't rush. He opened the drawer with a deliberate, haunting slowness. He saw the message. A single dot from Maria. In that heartbeat, the atmospheric pressure in the room seemed to drop. The cold, focused businessman vanished, replaced by the dragon that held Seoul's underworld in a throat grip. He didn't scream for his men. He didn't flip his desk. He simply stood up, his perfectly tailored black turtleneck stretching over shoulders that were suddenly squared for war. He looked at his reflection in the glass, his obsidian eyes reflecting the lightning that tore across the city sky. To the world, he was a sovereign of industry. To the men currently bleeding in St. Jude's, he was about to become an extinction event. He reached for a heavy, matte black handgun resting on the desk, the metal clicking into place with a sound of finality. "The wife is calling," he whispered to the empty room, his English perfect, his tone devoid of any heat. "Which means the city must burn." He turned and walked toward the private elevator, his pace a rhythmic, lethal march. Behind him, the digital map on his screens flickered and died as his security team diverted every satellite, every camera, and every street-level asset toward a single coordinate: St. Jude's Hospital. The dragon was no longer dormant. Back in the ward, Maria felt the vibration of the network's shadow falling over the building. She tucked the phone away and stepped back into the red-lit hallway. She could almost hear the roar of the engines in the distance. The assassins thought they were in control of a lockdown. They didn't realize that the man who owned the darkness was already on his way to reclaim it. The crimson pulse of the emergency lights acted as a countdown, rhythmically illuminating the carnage that was to come. In the nursing station, Dr. Phil was a shell of a man, his hands trembling so violently he had dropped his tablet. The other staff members, Rebecca and 2 orderlies, clung to each other, their faces pale masks of static terror. They were waiting for a leader, and they were looking at a man who only knew how to lead through a paycheck. Maria stepped out of the shadows. Her shoulders were back, her spine a column of tempered steel. The soft shuffle was gone, replaced by a stride that was silent and predatory. She didn't ask for permission. She took it. "Phil, shut up and listen," she commanded, her voice cutting through his frantic whimpering like a razor through gauze. He blinked, stunned by the sheer authority radiating from the woman he had called an NPC only an hour ago. "Rebecca, grab the trauma kits and the portable oxygen. We're moving." "Moving where?" Phil stammered. "The elevators are dead, and they're at the stairwells." "We aren't using the stairs," Maria said, crossing to the linen closet. She pulled a heavy service key from around her neck, one that didn't belong to any nurse. She shoved aside a row of industrial shelving to reveal a narrow, reinforced maintenance hatch leading to the HVAC service tunnels. These tunnels bypass the security sensors. They lead to the loading docks. If we stay here, we're targets. If we move, we're ghosts. She didn't wait for a rebuttal. She climbed into the hatch first, her movements efficient and practiced. As the staff followed, scrambling into the cramped metallic darkness of the vents, they saw Maria in a new light. She wasn't just navigating, she was clearing the path. She moved with a weighted silence, pausing at every junction to listen for the vibration of tactical boots on the floor above. The transition was absolute. The woman who had apologized for being in the way was now the only thing standing between them and a shallow grave. She moved like a general in a concrete labyrinth, her light blue scrubs now a uniform of war. When Rebecca's breathing became too loud, Maria placed a firm, grounding hand on her shoulder, her eyes projecting a terrifyingly calm confidence. "Stay focused on my heels," Maria whispered. "In this darkness, you aren't doctors or nurses. You are my responsibility. And I don't lose my patience." High above them, the muffled sound of an explosion rocked the building. Daquan was at the gates. Maria didn't flinch. She simply led them deeper into the shadows, a catalyst for survival in a world that had finally stopped underestimating her. The crawlspace terminated at a narrow ventilation grate overlooking the secondary pharmacy hub. Maria signaled the staff to remain motionless, her hand a firm, grounding weight on Rebecca's shoulder. Below them, the crimson strobe of the emergency lights caught the polished sheen of a ballistic mask. It was the leader, his movements jagged and impatient, the muzzle of his submachine gun sweeping the room in frustrated arcs. He was alone, separated from his team by the labyrinth Maria had forced them to navigate. She didn't hesitate. She eased the grate open with a silence that defied the metal's age and dropped. She landed like a shadow, the sound of her rubber-soled nursing shoes swallowed by the rhythmic hum of the failing life support systems. The assassin spun, but Maria was already a blur of light blue scrubs in the darkness. She didn't engage him where he was strong, she engaged him where the building was weak. With a practiced kick, she struck the emergency release valve of a wall-mounted fire suppression tank. A localized cloud of pressurized CO2 erupted, white and blinding, swallowing the red light and the assassin's line of sight. He fired blindly, the suppressed thuds of his weapon chewing into rows of plastic pill bottles. Maria didn't flinch. She knew every inch of this hub, the height of the counters, the exact location of the heavy mobile crash carts, and the blind spots of the overhead sensors. She surged through the mist, her silhouette appearing and vanishing like a ghost in a storm. She caught the man's wrist, slamming it against the edge of a steel dispensing station with the clinical force of a surgeon breaking a bone to set it. The gun clattered to the floor. "You're just a nurse," he gasped, his voice cracking as he lunged for a combat knife. Maria stepped into the light of a pulsing red beacon, the small cut on her cheek standing out like a brand. Her expression was devoid of fear, replaced by a sovereign, lethal calm. She gripped a heavy, weighted defibrillator paddle in her right hand, the coil wire wrapped around her fist like a flail. "I am the woman who kept you alive for 4 years by staying quiet," she said, her voice a cold, terrifying vibration that echoed off the tile. "But tonight, the hospital is closed." Before he could bridge the gap, she swung the heavy medical instrument with a momentum fueled by years of suppressed power. The impact was a dull, final thud against his temple. As he crumpled to the floor, Maria didn't look back. She picked up the discarded submachine gun, clearing the chamber with a metallic snick that sounded like an ending. The hunter had become the prey, and Maria Baker was no longer hiding in the shadows. She was the shadow. The front entrance of St. Jude's didn't explode, it simply ceased to be an obstacle. The reinforced glass doors, designed to withstand a riot, shivered and dissolved into 1,000 diamond-like shards as a black armored SUV breached the perimeter with surgical violence. But when the dust settled, there was no shouting, no chaotic gunfire, and no frantic orders. There was only the sound of a single pair of handmade Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. Yu Daquan stepped through the wreckage. He was a vision of terrifying order in a world of red-lit chaos. His charcoal suit was increased, his black turtleneck framing a face that was as still and beautiful as a funeral monument. Behind him, a dozen men in tactical gear moved like shadows, their suppressed weapons sweeping the lobby with a synchronization that made them look like a single, multi-headed organism. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The dragon was awake, and his silence was louder than any war cry. Daquan ignored the cowering security guards and the flickering monitors. His obsidian eyes were fixed on the map of the West Wing burned into his mind. He walked with a rhythmic, lethal grace, a man not looking for a fight, but coming to collect a debt. Every step he took toward the elevators seemed to drain the air from the room. On the fourth floor, the remaining assassins felt the shift. It was a primal recognition of a superior predator. The magnetic locks that had turned the ward into a cage suddenly groaned and retracted as his team overrode the system from a remote hub. Daquan didn't run. He didn't rush. He maintained the same steady, haunting pace through the crimson strobe of the emergency lights, passing the bodies Maria had left in her wake without a second glance. He reached the pharmacy hub just as the mist of the fire suppression system began to settle. He stopped. 20 feet away, Maria stood over the fallen leader, the submachine gun hanging loosely in her hand, her scrubs stained with the day's toll. For a long moment, the only sound was the rhythmic wheeze of the backup generators. Daquan's gaze swept over the small cut on her cheek, and for the first time, a fracture appeared in his emotional seal. His jaw tightened, a minute movement that, in his world, was equivalent to a declaration of war. He didn't check her pulse or ask if she was hurt. He simply closed the distance, his presence filling the vacuum of the hallway. He stopped an arm's length away, his eyes locked onto hers. "You're late," Maria whispered, her voice finally cracking as the adrenaline began to bleed away. Daquan reached out, his thumb grazing the cut on her mahogany skin with a tenderness that was more frightening than his wrath. "I was delayed," he replied softly, his voice a low, melodic vibration that promised a dark reckoning for the city outside. "I had to decide which of them would die first." The silence in the pharmacy hub was more suffocating than the smoke. Yu Daquan's hand remained on Maria's cheek, his thumb tracing the shallow cut with a reverent, terrifying focus. He didn't look at the fallen men or the shattered glass. He only looked at the crimson mark on his wife's mahogany skin. It was a small wound, barely a scratch in the eyes of a medical professional, but in the world of the dragon, it was a desecration of a sanctuary. "Who?" he asked. The word wasn't a question, it was a sentence of death. Maria didn't have to point. At the far end of the hall, the lead assassin, the man she had neutralized with the defibrillator, groaned, his fingers clawing weakly at the linoleum as he tried to drag his broken body toward a discarded sidearm. He was a professional, a man who had ended dozens of lives, but as Daquan's shadow fell over him, he looked like a child facing a tidal wave. Daquan walked toward him. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need one. He moved with a heavy rhythmic grace, each footfall an echo of a closing coffin lid. The assassin looked up, his eyes wide behind the cracked ballistic mask, recognizing the face of the man who ruled the very underworld that had paid for this hit. "Wait," the man wheezed, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "It was just a job. We didn't know who she was." Daquan stopped, looking down at the man with a clinical, detached curiosity. He knelt, not out of mercy, but to ensure his voice was the last thing the killer would ever hear. "You looked at her and saw a nurse," Daquan whispered, his voice as cold as the Han River in January. "You looked at her and saw someone you could break. But the woman you touched is the only reason I haven't burned this city to ash. You didn't just hurt a woman. You scratched the soul of the dragon." With a movement too fast for the human eye to follow, Daquan gripped the man's throat, lifting him several inches off the ground. There was no struggle, only the sickening, wet sound of a larynx collapsing under the pressure of a sovereign's hand. Daquan didn't look away. He watched the light fade from the man's eyes with the same unwavering focus he used to sign a billion-dollar merger. He dropped the body like a piece of discarded trash and stood, taking a silk handkerchief from his pocket to wipe a single drop of the man's blood from his cuff. He turned back to Maria, his expression shifting from a monster to a husband in a heartbeat. Behind him, his tactical team moved in, not to fight, but to clean. They worked with the same silent, terrifying efficiency as their master, ensuring that by sunrise, there would be no evidence that a war had ever occurred in the West Wing. Daquan reached Maria and draped his charcoal suit jacket over her blood-stained scrubs, his eyes softening as he pulled her into the protection of his shadow. The world thought they had seen a massacre, they had actually seen a tithe. And the price of a single scratch had been paid in full. The dawn light that filtered through the reinforced glass of St. Jude's a week later was different. Crisper, cleaner, and devoid of the crimson dread that had stained the hallways. The hospital had been repaired with a speed that defied public records, funded by an anonymous donor whose influence moved faster than city permits. But the most profound change wasn't the fresh paint or the new security scanners. It was the atmosphere of the West Wing. Maria Baker walked down the corridor, and the soft shuffle was gone. Her gait was measured, her shoulders square, and her eyes held the steady, unblinking clarity of a woman who had seen the abyss and walked back out of it. As she approached the central hub, the usual cacophony of barking orders and dismissive chatter died instantly. Dr. Phil was standing by the charts, but he wasn't looking at his phone. When Maria drew near, he straightened his posture, a flicker of genuine, hard-earned respect, and perhaps a lingering touch of fear, crossing his face. He stepped aside, clearing a path for her as if she were the chief of surgery. "The morning reports are ready for your review, Maria," he said, his voice quiet and devoid of its former condescension. He didn't call her an NPC. He didn't look through her. "Thank you, doctor," she replied, her voice no longer a melodic tremor but a calm, authoritative command. She picked up the tablet, her platinum band catching the light, no longer hidden beneath a layer of apology. Rebecca and the other nurses watched her with a mixture of awe and devotion. They didn't see a nobody anymore. They saw the general who had led them through the dark. When a new intern began to complain about the workload, Rebecca silenced him with a sharp look and a single nod toward Maria. The hierarchy had been rewritten in the shadows of the lockdown, and the woman in the light blue scrubs was now its undisputed sovereign. "The board finalized the promotion," Phil added, handing her a small, plastic-wrapped box. "They said the West Wing needed a new charge nurse. Someone who understands the value of order." Maria opened the box. The name badge didn't just have her name, it carried the weight of her new reality. She clipped it to her crisp scrubs, the blue fabric as sharp as a uniform. As the shift ended, Maria walked toward the front entrance. She didn't try to disappear into the walls. Through the glass doors, a single black armored SUV sat idling at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the rising sun like a shield. A driver in a sharp black suit stood by the rear door, waiting. She paused for a moment, looking back at the ward. The war was over, but her mission had only just begun. Maria stepped out into the morning air, no longer a ghost, but a queen returning to her throne. The dragon was waiting, and for the first time in 4 years, Maria Baker was finally home.